It's no wonder our people are turned off and embarrassed by it. I would like to suggest a new approach and a new way of thinking about evangelism. And I will agree that my thoughts on evangelism have continued to evolve as we've done it. We do 5, 6, 7 meetings a year. We've done that since we've started. And we've done a lot of it. And you would think by the time you've done 30 or 35 meetings, you would have figured it out. And I haven't. I'm constantly surprised. I constantly think, times we're going to do this, and it's going to work, and it doesn't. And I do something else that I'm not sure is going to work, and it works. It's just the way it is. I'd like to suggest a new way to think about evangelism. And it's basically this. It's not that we need to work harder. It's not that you even need to do more meetings. Because I would suspect that you are doing evangelism. At Southwest Union, we believe in evangelism. We get money from, as a reversion to come back to help us do meetings, and they tie those funds to public evangelism. And so chances are you are doing it. So it's not about working harder. It's not even necessarily about doing more meetings unless you feel like you want to do that. It's about doing it in a different way. That's what I would like to suggest to you this morning. Because a lot of people look at what we have done at Adventist Fellowship and say, well, we just got to do it more often. And I think you miss it if you do that. It's not just that we're doing the same thing at a much quicker pace. But I believe we've looked at evangelism and we've really tried to see it for what it is. And our mindset toward evangelism is different. So here are some suggestions that I would like to make. Evangelism is not about manipulating people. It is cooperating with God and what He is doing in a person's life. That's what evangelism is all about. We somehow think that this evangelism thing is about duping our friends or our family through a process that's going to take 5 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever it is. They're going to come 5 nights a week, and at the end, they're going to wake up and be an Adventist and not realize how they got there. There are probably some people that have experienced that. That is not evangelism the way that God calls us to do it. It's not about manipulating people. In fact, we need to acknowledge the truth here today. As pastors, we can't make people do anything, as much as we try. I admit it. I'm a control freak. I like being in control, and sometimes, I have this attitude that if I can do things just right, people will have to respond. It isn't that way. You can preach the sermon that God has given to you. The Holy Spirit can bless that, and people are not necessarily all going to respond the way that you would want. Evangelism from the start is really something that takes place between a person and their God. And God invites us into that process. God invites us to come alongside that person as God is doing something in their life. Evangelism is what God does. It's not what our church does, I guess is what I'm saying. I mean, we put ourselves into that arena, but never lose sight of the fact that it's God that is at work. In fact, I'm convinced the less that we interfere and the less that we do, the better. God's the master evangelist, isn't He? I mean, he's the one that knows how to do it. People ask me, how many non-believers come to your meetings? How many non-believers are coming to your meeting? Because they often will say, well, Adventism and public evangelism is just about winning sheep from other churches. And by the way, since we're on that, doesn't God also call us to do that? He does. He does. The gospel commission to us as Seventh-day Adventists is twofold. We recognize that outside of Adventism, there are born-again Christians, aren't there? We work with them and we live among them in our communities. But we have a message for them. And I'm not going to pretend that we don't. A Baptist and a Methodist can be doing something and be quite happy, but as soon as you add an Adventist, the Adventists ought to be thinking, how can I win these two? Why? Because we have a unique message. We have something that every person needs to hear. And so, I don't make any apologies for trying to win people to Adventism that are parts of other faith groups. I want them to know what I have experienced. And so we get that criticism, so people will say, well, how many non-believers show up at your evangelistic meetings? And my usual response is, none. No unbeliever. Why would an unbeliever come to an evangelistic meeting? I was doing a meeting down in Plano, Texas for a church plant down there, and I actually did have one who showed up. He introduced himself. He said, hi, I've been enjoying meetings. I'm an atheist. I said, well, welcome to our prophecy seminar. And I was thinking to myself, what a strange place for an atheist. I said, at the end of the day, he wasn't an atheist. He was pretending to be an atheist. But obviously, to come night after night after night, he's a believer. He just doesn't know it. So I believe that as we do this evangelism thing that we do, at least in Tulsa, we don't have a lot of non-believers there. That's not to say that a week before the meeting or a month before the meeting they weren't unbelievers. But by the time they walk into our meeting, they're believers. They want to be believers. They're disposed to be believers. And so if you're going to do evangelism, it helps to believe that God is already at work, that God goes before you, that God is already at work as you're planning, as you're thinking about it, that God will be involved in that God goes before us. That's what we believe. People ask, how can you do that many meetings? Because we believe God always works. God's at work today, tomorrow, next. My own experience, I came into the Seventh-day Adventist Church the very first night as a believer. I'd been a believer for about 10 days. 10 days. It was in my living room after a day at work. No crisis, no preacher, no television, no radio. But I gave my heart to the Lord, and I was a believer that night. I just didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know how to be a Christian. And a handbill doesn't even come to me, comes to my mother, and she calls me because she knows I just became a believer and she wanted to invite me to a seminar. So that handbill, that prophecy seminar didn't make me a believer because God had made me a believer. God had done a work in my life. And I believe that happens all the time. Amen. All the time. So if you believe that God is at work, and God does that, because He's the one that goes and sows seed according to the parable, the Son of Man sows the seed. In fact, if you really look at it, God, and I'm not saying we shouldn't sow seed, because we should and we could, but in the parable, God is the one who sows. We reap. And that's what evangelism is all about. It's about the harvest. We believe that God goes before us, that God is at work. And we pray constantly that God will be at work in our community. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 37 is a text I know you've read it many times. My good friend Derek Morris has just recently written a book about the radical prayer. Amen. And it deals with this idea. In verse 37 he said unto the disciples, the harvest truly is plenteous. We would say it, the harvest is plentiful. Think about where you pastor today. Through the eyes of Jesus, He would look at your community, and you know what He says about that community? The harvest is plentiful. You might have been in that community for years. Your people probably think the people aren't interested. No one wants to know about Adventism. No one is interested in attending a meeting, whatever, but God looks and sees the harvest. He says the harvest is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Verse 38, pray ye therefore, Lord of the harvest, that he will send forth laborers into the harvest. As we go into the vineyard, we acknowledge that God has already been there, that God is already there, that God has already scattered the seed, that there is already fruit. Amen. I've never been a farmer. I've played around with a garden, but I've gotten too frustrated with that. But I can tell you this. Harvest time isn't the same as sowing time. And again, I have no problem with us sowing, and we'll talk more about that later, but we need to acknowledge that God has said there's a harvest out there. The question is, will you believe God? Because what I see a lot in Seventh-day Adventist churches is they don't believe this verse. They don't believe this verse. They maybe have done something in the past that hasn't produced the kind of harvest they wanted or the kind of response they wanted, and so they have concluded that God is wrong. There's harvest other places, but not in my field. We get these old magazines that come to our home, and we read about the Inter-American Division and in Africa and other places, and we see a harvest. But I believe God is telling us today there's a harvest in our own church, in our own neighborhood, in our own field. This coming Sabbath, I'm going to be baptizing a young lady. I just, yesterday as a matter of fact, had the opportunity to clear her for baptism. And I always ask, because our church is large enough that a lot of times I'm not even involved in new attenders, and I'm kind of left out, and I just don't have the time to touch everyone on a Sabbath morning. And so as I was meeting with her, because she had indicated at the close of a meeting I'd done a call and she wanted to be baptized. And so I had no idea where she was at. Was she at the beginning of this experience? Was she ready? And so, sure enough, she's ready to be baptized. And as I was going through, I asked her one question. I said, is there one person here? Is there one person in our church family that you could point to that is the reason why you have given your heart to the Lord and you want to be baptized and become a part of our church? Without question, she mentioned somebody's name. A new believer. I mean, a new member. Somebody that's probably only about a year being a part of our church. And she said, I work with him. And I said, really? And they said, yeah, we work together, and we've been talking a lot about the Lord. I said, so he invited you to church? And she said, no, not once, not twice, not 3 times. I said, how many times? She said, he's invited me at least 15 times. She said, I don't know why, but I finally just gave in one day. And I came to church. And it didn't end there. She had some children. He talked her into going to VBS. And then he talked her into going to be a part of their small group. And he said, because of his involvement in my life, that's why I'm a Christian today. That's why I want to be baptized. And I said, really? I said, yeah. She is. But let me tell you what's really exciting is we work in the same place, and about 2 weeks ago, even before she had decided that she wanted to be a member, we talked about how we're going to win everyone else in our. They work for Coca-Cola. It's a big. It's a call center, inbound calls, and they're working there. And she said, just yesterday, I moved my desk so I could be a part of another group and I could talk to them. She called them targets. Said, Ontario and I have 15 targets that we're working on. There's a harvest out there. You know, Ontario, all I did was keep asking her to come to church. He didn't really do anything. He didn't make her want to be spiritual. But you have to believe that there's a harvest. I can't tell you how many times at the beginning of an evangelistic meeting that I see people come in and they're ready. It's ripe fruit. I've told this story, and it happens almost every meeting. If we have a good-sized crowd, I'll walk by somebody, are you the pastor? Yes, I'm the pastor. He says, I want to be baptized. First night, before we've ever started. Or second night, and I'm thinking, we haven't preached to you yet. We haven't done what we need to do to prepare you for that, only to find out that they really had done something. I don't know if I've ever shared the story of a young man that was coming to one of our meetings. We had been doing a lot of meetings in the church, and because of some things that were going on in our church, we couldn't have the evangelistic meeting in our church, so we decided to have it in a hotel. One of the rare meetings that we have off-site. And this was just like any other meeting that we had done. And opening night, we had about 40 or 50 people attend. That's a good meeting for us. We don't need hundreds of people showing up at one time. We find that we can't really handle a huge group, and so we do smaller meetings, and we do a smaller crowd, but we do more of them. This young man had come in opening night, and he had sat right on the front row. And I don't know if you're this way, but I am. When I do evangelism, I look over the crowd, and I see the people I really want to win. Don't you? You know, you kind of look at it and think, oh, they'd be great church members. Oh, they would just be great to have in your church. And he was one of them. He sat up on the front, young guy, not quite 30, good-looking guy, sat up there, and he really loved being preached to. I love people like that. You know, really getting into the sermon. And I just preached my sermon to him, and everybody else got to listen. And I preached night after night. He came in and kept sitting in the same place. And the night I preached the Sabbath, he was there, and he was nodding. And man, I thought, home run. The next night, when I was going to finish up on the Sabbath talking about Sunday, his chair was empty. That's what I don't like about evangelism. You know, it hurts. It hurts to see people reject things or whatever. He wasn't there, and I thought, well, maybe it's a fluke. And so the next night, he still wasn't there, and I thought, man, we lost him. The rest of the seminar, he didn't come back. Finally, after about 3 nights of him not being there, I asked the people in the back about his name. And I got his name, and he didn't give us an address, so there was no way for me to get a hold of him. You see, I don't visit people during an evangelistic meeting. I know some evangelists will tell you you should, but I don't. If they're coming, I leave them alone. Why go screw it up by, and visiting them, or just get out of the way. It's our philosophy. Get out of the way of what God is doing. But if they quit coming, I usually don't go visit them either, and I'll invite them the next time. And so the rest of the meeting went on, and Josh never showed up again. And I'd written him off, as we do a lot of people that we have a meeting and they stop coming, and for whatever reason we feel like it just didn't work. A couple weeks later, actually about a week later, I get a phone call at the church, and it's Josh. And he says, I had to go out of town. I had a trip planned and I missed some of the seminar. He said, do you have that on tape? I said, yeah. He said, could I come by and get it? And I said, yes. And so I wasn't able to meet him that day, but he came by, he picked up the tapes, and still I didn't have an address or any way to get a hold of him. And another week or so goes by, and Josh calls me again, and he says, hey, been listening to those tapes. And I said, good. I said, is there anything you want to talk about? He said, no, but would it be okay if I came to church? I said, yep. And so Josh started coming to church, and he took his same spot there, front row, second seat, displaced somebody. It was okay. And Josh sat there, and I preached to Josh for the next several weeks. Still not sure what's going on, but given Josh time. And finally, Josh called me up one day, and he said, I need to talk to you. And I said, okay. And so we made an appointment, and I heard the story. And again, I'm saying all this to illustrate what God does as we do what we do, how God goes before us. Josh had an amazing story. One of those stories you hear that when you get done, you just get chills to know what God had done for us and for him. Josh is a professional tennis player. He's apparently not very good, but made a good living. You know, I think he was like number 150 seated, you know. Good-looking guy, made a lot of money on the tour circuit. He says, you know, you don't have to win tournaments to make money in tennis. You get sponsors and you get appearance money, and when you do finish, you make quite a bit of money. And so he said, I was a professional tennis player. When I was younger, I had a kind of a spiritual experience with the Lord, and I felt like he was calling me into ministry. And I said, what did you do about that? And he goes, I was good at tennis, and I wanted to play tennis. And you can't be, he said, you can't be a Christian and be a professional tennis player. Drugs and steroids and women and all those other things. And so he said, I wanted to be a tennis player, and so I did that. And he said, over the last several years, I don't know, I said, I've just kind of become dissatisfied, and I didn't really know why, but I was on a trip, and he was on an airplane, and he was going to New York City. He flew into an airport, and he got off his plane and was making his connection, and as he got to the other connecting flight, he realized that he had left a jacket, an expensive sport jacket, in the other plane. The plane was boarding at the time. He told the flight attendant or the gate agent there about the situation. She says, you don't have time to go. We need to close the plane and go. You're not going to be able to get your jacket. As Josh is getting ready to make his way onto the plane, apparently there's this guy, a grounds personnel dressed in a jumpsuit, that had been listening to the conversation, and he walked up to Josh and he said, this might sound strange, but he said, if I get your coat back for you, will you promise to go to church? Josh hadn't been thinking about church at all, didn't know who this guy was or what, and Josh said, excuse me? And he said, if I get your coat back, will you go to church? Josh really still didn't know what to do, and so the guy raises his voice now. Here at the, you know, with all this commotion on, he said, "If I get your coat back, will you promise to go to church?" And Josh, to shut the guy up, said yes. So Josh got on the plane. He was one of the last ones to board. He was sitting in the back of the plane, and as he turns around to get ready to be seated, the guy followed him onto the plane. And the guy's now standing in the aisleway, and he says, "Remember, you promised that if you get your coat back, you'll go to church." And Josh kind of nods and trying to make this guy go away. And this guy won't go away. And in front of everybody, in a loud voice, he says, "I want everybody to hear his promise." He's promised that if I get his coat back, he's going to go to church. Josh is embarrassed to no end. He wants to crawl under his chair. And so the whole crowd was egging him on and kind of jeering him a little bit, and Josh says, "Yes, I promise." So the guy gets off. The plane lands in New York City. Josh goes to his hotel room. He checks into his hotel. He stays the night there. He's awoken in the morning by a phone. And it's the concierge. He says, "We have something down here for you." Josh, not really putting this together, kind of gets dressed, goes down there, and there on one of those little luggage carts, hanging in a plastic sleeve, is his sport jacket. As Josh walks up to that, his cell phone rings. Josh answers the phone, says, "Hello." They said, "Is this Josh?" And Josh said, "Yes." He said, "Did you get your coat back?" Josh said, "Yes." He said, "Remember your promise," and he hung up. Literally. Josh now doesn't know what to do, other than he's made a promise to go to church. Josh has a friend, a teenage friend, that is involved in Rhema Bible College. Rhema Bible College is in Broken Arrow, a suburb of Tulsa. It's where Kenneth Hagin and now Kenneth Hagin Jr. Ministries. And so Josh leaves New York City, gets on a plane, and goes to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Doesn't have anywhere to stay, so he goes out of the airplane to the big marquee and finds a hotel, gets a shuttle to the hotel, walks into the hotel. Guess what hotel it was, by the way? It was Saturday that day, and Josh checks in, and he's on his way up to his room, and he passes by a little marquee sitting on a tripod that says Free Bible Prophecy Seminar, starting that night. Josh came into our meeting, not knowing what he was doing. He'd attended there, and in the course of attending there, he did that first Sunday morning go to Rhema Bible College and really didn't know what God was calling him to do. Didn't get a lot out of it. You know, Rhema Bible College, their worship experience is mostly music and high energy stuff, and there were people behaving in a way that made Josh a little uncomfortable. He'd never been around that. And so he came back to the hotel, and he was attending this, and Josh left. Josh is sitting here telling me all of this in my office. And I said, well, what do you make of all this, Josh? And he goes, I don't know, but what I've heard I believe is true. And I said, well, Josh, have you given your heart to the Lord? And he said, oh, yes, during the meetings. The night you talked about that, I gave my heart to the Lord, and he says, I believe I'm a Christian. And I said, well, wonderful. How can I help you? He goes, well, I still believe God might be calling me to ministry. I said, well, Josh, after hearing that story, I think you might be right. And he said, what do I do? Where do I go? I said, well, what do you want to do? And he goes, well, Raymond's over there. And I said, well, you know, what was your experience there? And I said, basically, I said, how do you believe it? How do you feel about all the things you've learned in the prophecy seminar and you've listened on tape? And he said, well, I believe it. And I said, well, if you're going to be a pastor, wouldn't you like to teach what you believe? He said, yeah. He said, do you think I could go to school? Do you have any schools that teach people how to be a pastor? I said, yeah, we've got a few of those. And he said he was going on trips, so the next day I was supposed to print off some information, so I printed off Southwestern, I printed off Andrews, I printed off Loma Linda and a few other schools there, and I put a package together and I gave it to him, and I sent him on his way. About a week later, Josh calls me, and he says, can we meet? I said, yes. He said, I've been thinking a lot about what we're doing. I'm thinking this guy's not even an Adventist yet. You know, he needs to be a member, he needs to be baptized, and so he says, I think I've decided to go to Andrews. He said, that's where the seminary is, so I might as well go there. Josh doesn't have any undergraduate either, so he's not talking about a few years, he's talking about 6 years or more. And so I said, yes. He said, I still remember what he said. He said, do you think you can get me in? I said, well, do you have any money? Oh, I got cash. I said, I think I can get you in. School's getting ready to start in just a few weeks, but I said, Josh, what about baptism? Have you thought about being baptized? Oh, yes. I said, would you like to be baptized? Would you like to become a Seventh-day Adventist and study to go into the ministry? He said, yes. That next Sabbath, we baptized Josh into the Seventh-day Adventist Church. 3 days later, he was on campus at Andrews University. And he's still there. He's still there. And you know, as I think about that story, it's not alone. I mean, it's not the only story. There are so many stories that are just like that you and I probably never even get to hear. Because something happens, and sometimes we're just not in the right place at the right time. In the experience of Josh, and I would say even in my own experience, God was already at work. God is working. God knows if you're interested in working in the harvest. We had the same experience. I was asked to do a meeting over in New Zealand, and the church hadn't done any evangelism. In fact, they'd given up on evangelism. They said evangelism doesn't work anymore, and they had heard about some of the things that had happened. They had asked me to come and do a meeting, and they said, it's the most amazing thing that happened. I said, what's that? And he said, when we voted to do the meeting, it was going to be 6 months, we began to work, and we began to organize, whatever, and from that very day that we decided that we were going to have a meeting, God's been sending people to our church. People have been walking in. Previous Adventists or people that have Adventist contact. The night we opened our evangelistic meeting, somebody called the church and said, I am a Sunday school teacher and I have to teach a lesson on Daniel. And I've heard that you guys have a prophecy seminar that's starting tonight. What's tonight's topic? And they said, Daniel chapter 2. And the person showed up. She's not a Sunday school teacher anymore. She's a Sabbath school teacher now. But, that's what we find, that God goes before us. Evangelism isn't something that we do to manipulate people. It isn't something that we do to try to force people to do something. It's putting ourselves in a position that says, God, we're going to cooperate with what you're doing. We're going to pray, and we're going to ask God to go before us and prepare the way. When we do that, when we have that attitude, evangelism is full of miracles. I mean, it is miracle stuff.